appropriate that we again just take a moment to immerse ourselves in a portion of Isaiah 53. And this week I'll read from about verse 6. All of us, like sheep, have strayed away. We have left God's paths to follow our own. Yet the Lord laid on him the sins of us all. He was oppressed and treated harshly, yet he never said a word. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep is silent before the shearers, he did not open his mouth. Unjustly condemned, he was led away. No one cared that he died without descendants, or that his life was cut short in midstream. But he was struck down for the rebellion of us all. In a former life, I used to work for a large corporation. And back in those days, before the days of social media, and some of us will remember the days before email, working for a large corporation was quite different because the engagement one had with the CEO was slightly harder than it is today. At least that was in my experience. And so the company that I used to work for, I was just a serviceman in the ranks, if that made sense. And our CEO, he was very, very hard to have any contact with because he was removed by geography and he had what I call his people around him that kept him quite isolated from the rest of us. And the thing that I struggled with was I had this idea that I was quite convinced that if the CEO knew, then I thought that it might be beneficial to the company as a whole. And it bugged me, and I thought, how can I get in touch with this guy? And so I wrote him a letter, no response. I turned up at his office one day, he was out, so it just wasn't really kind of going to happen. But anyway, fast forward to the Christmas party of that particular year, and I met, so this was a large business, had 15 or 1600 people on staff, and at the Christmas party I got yakking to someone who I'd never met before, and it turned out that he worked for the business as well. And so we were talking, and anyway, one thing sort of led to another, and I sort of started picking his brains about this idea that I had. And he said to me these words, and I won't forget it. He says, "Hey, my dad might be interested in what you're saying." I went, "Your dad? Who's your dad?" He said, "Come with me." And before the evening was out, I'd had an audience with the CEO of this company, right? So it's not what you know, it's who you know. And that illustration stuck with me because for many years after that, we had regular contact. I had regular contact with the CEO. And in fact, even after I left that business, I still had contact with him after that. But I thought that was an interesting illustration because it very much illustrates what the centre of the gospel is about. We have access to God through the Son. We could do everything in our power to try and get to God, but actually he had to make it possible for us to come to him. And the pathway which he provided, of course, was his Son, Jesus Christ. Now this message is called Blood is Thicker Than Water. And when we come to Christ, we become a part of his family. We have direct access to God through Christ. And so this morning we're going to unpack a little bit further in our lead up to Easter the sheer significance of what has been achieved through Christ's death and resurrection and God's long-term planning of it, all so that we can have direct access to him. Now, the Bible reading this morning, you would go, where on earth is this guy coming from? We're coming up to Easter and we're in the book of Ezekiel. A few years ago, I read this thing that said that the book of Ezekiel was one of the most disregarded books in the Bible. This was just something that I read. And I went, yeah? So what I did from that point was I committed 6 months, might be slightly longer than that, to just reading it every day. Oh my goodness, what a rush. It was awesome. But I'm going to reread that text now. So if you have your Bible with you, please turn to Ezekiel chapter 1. And it will make sense, I promise you. Verse 1, in my 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day, while I was among the exiles by the Keba River, the heavens were opened and I saw visions of God. On the 5th of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, by the Keba River in the land of the Babylonians. There the hand of the Lord was on him. I looked and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing light and surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal, and in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance, their form was human, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and their feet were like those of a calf, and gleamed like burnished bronze. Under their wings, on the 4 sides, they had human hands. All 4 of them had faces and wings, and the wings of one touched the wings of another. Each one went straight ahead, and they did not turn as they moved. Their faces looked like this. Each of the 4 had the face of a human being, and on the right side each had the face of a lion, and on the left side the face of an ox. Each also had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. They each had 2 wings spreading out upward, each wing touching that of the creature on either side, and each had 2 other wings covering its body. Each one went straight ahead. Wherever the Spirit would go, they would go, without turning as they went. Now you read that today and you go, what on earth has that got to do with Easter? In order to understand, we're going to do a quick overview of the history of Israel. Here we go. Reader's Digest condensed version. God made a covenant with Israel. With this covenant, the outcomes were, if you obeyed the covenant, it led to blessings. If you disobeyed the covenant, it led to cursings and the promise that he would wipe the nation out if they were disobedient. Israel was told, you were to have no king but God himself. However, it's interesting that we know Israel cried to God for a king. I find it interesting that they were told to have no king, but Moses had written in advance, the day will come when you cry out for a king, and so when you look for a king, this is the kind of guy that you're going to look for, right? And so it led to a monarchy, if you like, of 3 kings that reigned. Saul, David, and Solomon. At the end of Solomon's reign, there was a civil war, and the north, it led to 2 portions, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Now, both of these spaces went through good and bad patches, but overall there was continued disobedience. And so the northern kingdom, God raised up Assyria to wipe them out. And the northern kingdom was no more. Then in the southern kingdom, a guy called Nebuchadnezzar turns up to wipe them out because of their continued disobedience. And in the process of doing that, there were 3 major attacks on Jerusalem, and it led to what we call three deportations. And in the first attack, Daniel and his friends, Daniel in the lion's den, or that guy, he was taken away in the first group with Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar set up a leader in his place, that was meant to represent him in Jerusalem, and of course they rebelled, and so Nebuchadnezzar returned again, and he took some more people away in slavery. And in that second time, Ezekiel was in that group. And everything that we read about in the book of Ezekiel is his visions of the final attack on Jerusalem that was going to happen, where Jerusalem would eventually be wiped out. So all of his visions are about the third and final deportation yet to happen. And then the end of the book is all about the building of a new temple that will happen in the distant future. Now in chapter 1, we see that Ezekiel, he turns 30. We also learnt that he was a priest. Turning 30 was significant because that was the age that a young man who could become a priest was able to serve in the temple. So he's in captivity, he's living by the river Kibar, and in chapter 1 he has this experience in which God calls him to be a prophet. And in this vision, when you read it, there are lots of things happening. If you Google this vision, by the way, you will read everything that it was an alien encounter, through to the fact that Ezekiel was hallucinating big time. But actually, we know that God himself turned up and called Ezekiel to be a prophet. Now, all that's out of the way. For the purposes of this morning, I just want us to focus on the faces of the 4 living creatures: the lion, the ox, the man, and the eagle. Now, for some of you sitting here this morning, you'll be going, these faces seem familiar. Why do these faces seem familiar? That's what happened with me, because they reminded me of another part of the Bible. But when I started researching it, it didn't take me to where I was expecting to go. Before I continue this morning, I want to remind us of this picture. Can I have the next slide up? Thank you. Yeah. Now, I showed this picture when it might have been the second week that I was here. But this might be the most amazing data-filled diagram or image that you might see. It's by artist Chris Harrison, and it's using information by another guy who's a biblical researcher and pastor, Christoph Remhold, his name was. And it shows 63,779 cross-references in the Bible. Right? So how it works is the line down below starts here. It's Genesis on this side, Revelation on this side, and it's where they have found that the Bible cross-references itself. Now, the weird thing about this picture is, of course, a lot of the Bible cross-references itself not only backwards, but it cross-references itself forward in things that haven't happened yet, or things that hadn't happened yet. So, and there's a colour key and all that kind of stuff. But the Bible that we have was written, many Bible teachers say this, by 40 different authors over 1,500 years, right? Famous radio program for those of you know that use those words. But 40 people over 1,500 years on 3 different continents, and many of those people never met each other. A guy called Jordan Peterson, for those of you that know him, slightly controversial character. I like a lot of what he has to say. But he was the guy that came up with the idea that the Bible is hyperlinked. And I completely agree with him. For those of you that don't know what hyperlinked means, it's like when you go on to Wikipedia and you start looking at something, for example, and then you'll see something in blue, and so you go, oh, that's interesting, so you click on that and it takes you to another topic. And then in that you see something in blue, so and so you started out, I don't know, researching sunflowers, and then suddenly you're 10 steps away reading about, I don't know, ancient boats that were built to transport sunflowers, right? So it's that kind of thing. That's a really bad example, but you understand what I'm saying. So the reason I want to show you that is that it shouldn't be surprising when you take that into account that the book of Ezekiel will actually shed some kind of light on Easter. So, building on this, I made a discovery a number of years ago regarding the faces in this text. So the face of a man, the face of a lion, the face of an ox, and the face of an eagle. And it turns out that if we start with this text, we have this invitation to look at the salvation plan in a slightly different light. So, it's actually an invitation for us to revisit the tabernacle in the Old Testament. So, let's map this out a bit. So, in the front was the face of a man. On the left side was the face of an ox. On the back of the head was the face of an eagle. And on the right side was the face of a lion. And you go, so what? Now, it turns out that at Mount Sinai, when God gave the plans for building the tabernacle to Moses, God made it clear that the tabernacle was to be central to the life of the community. So, when Israel would travel, the tabernacle was packed up. How they knew it was time to move was the presence of God would rise from the tabernacle. Then they would pack the tabernacle up, and God would lead them in the wilderness, either by a pillar of fire at night or a cloud during the day. The rabbis refer to this as something called the Shekinah glory, right? That's not in the Bible. It's a bit like we don't have the word Trinity in the Bible to explain something that we see. But they use a term, the Shekinah glory. But the tabernacle was packed up, and then when they camped, the tabernacle would be assembled, and each tribe would camp around the tabernacle in an allocated position. So you couldn't just wander off and put your tent anywhere that you like, because that would actually break their laws. So each tribe had their own banner that they would travel under. So there were 12 tribes, 12 banners. But when they went into camp, there became 4 camps of 3 tribes each. And the 3 tribes, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun, would camp under the banner of a lion. 3 tribes, Reuben, Simeon, and Gad, they would camp to the south under the banner of a man. 3 tribes, Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin, headed up by the tribe of Ephraim, by the way, they would camp to the west of the tabernacle under the banner of an ox. 3 tribes, Dan, Asher, and Naphtali, headed up by the tribe of Dan, would camp to the north side of the tabernacle under the banner of an eagle. And you can read all about the way that the camp was laid out in Numbers chapter 2, plus other places, but Numbers 2 is a good place to start. Now, where it gets really weird is that in other parts of the Torah, it was illegal to camp either southwest, northwest, southeast, the other one, the other east, right? Also, we see in Ezekiel's vision, each living creature with the 4 faces would only move in straight lines. Really weird thing. So there seems to be this consistency in the text. Now, if you do a Google search we go back to Google. Can I have the next slide up there? You will find all sorts of diagrams and pictures depicting the layout of the camp, and you will see some amazing works, amazing art, right? I look at some of them and go, wow, this is awesome. The only problem with some of that art is that it has been done by artists, not by theologians, all right? So just be aware of that. So just because there's something that turns up on Google doesn't necessarily mean it's right, okay? And because there's a difference between what an artist does without taking everything into account, and with what some of our scholars do through academic journals and stuff. But anyway, when you add in the populations of each tribe in proportion to the size of the tabernacle, along with the instructions that no one was allowed to camp northeast, northwest, southeast, or southwest, then some of the pictures that you see will not make sense. However, when you consider all of the information, then this is what you get. Can I have the next? Okay. So, this is the layout of the tabernacle when they were camping. East is at the bottom of the diagram here. The Levites and Moses sit on the east side where the door is. So east is down the bottom, and where I've got Levites in brackets, the Levites kind of sat between where the picture of the lion is and the tabernacle. The camp of Judah was supposed to be east of the Levites. That was an interesting thing that's singled out in the Bible. And Reuben was supposed to camp south of the Levites. So the Levites, where they camped in proportion to others, is very important. Now, if we add in the population scale, following all of the rules, then this is what we see. Judah is the longest to the east, 188,100. Ephraim was shortest to the west, 108,100. Reuben, about the same as Dan, 151,000. And Dan, who is about the same as Reuben, was 157,000. Their length was in proportion to their populations. And if we can have the next slide, I find that fascinating. It's just all these little things that we can miss in the text. You can see where I'm going with this, right? So you've got to remember that the whole life of the Israelite camp was based around this idea of the shedding of blood. Remember, we talked last week about the fact that when someone sinned, there were different types of sacrifices that would need to take place depending on the sin. In some cases, they brought an innocent animal to sacrifice. They'd put their hand on the head of the animal. They would confess their sin at the moment that the life was taken from the animal, and the blood would be shed. On one day in a calendar year, there was a day called the Day of Atonement. And the Day of Atonement was the one day of the year that the high priest could enter into a place called the Holy of Holies, and there was a blood ritual that would happen around involving an innocent lamb in that place. Now, it's interesting because when you do reading around that, you discover that if the high priest was not properly prepared, it could cost him his life. Dangerous. So he used to have, according to Jewish tradition, a rope tied around one of his feet so that if he dropped dead in the sanctuary, they could pull him out safely. Right? This is it's kind of like dangerous stuff. But we also talked last week about how this was actually quite ineffective, because these kinds of sacrifices would have to be done over and over and over again. And so God sent his son as a permanent solution to this. Jesus only had to shed his blood once on the cross, and it opened the way permanently. It amazes me that when we look at this picture, if I could have the next one, cool, that the old sacrificial system was already pointing to the cross of Christ. It was right in front of their eyes, but they couldn't see it at the time. It's easy for us to look back in hindsight and go, oh my goodness. But they were right in the middle of this, and they wouldn't have known it. Now, the story of these four faces, the lion, the ox, the man, and the eagle, does not end there. Now, when I first looked at the text, I went, oh my goodness, it's the symbols of the gospel. That was what initially attracted me. I went, oh wow. So, the book of Matthew, if you were to summarize Matthew, he is a Jew who speaks of the Messiah, the King. His sign is the lion. Mark is the writer who talks of Jesus as the servant. You will notice in the book of Mark there is no genealogy, right? Because no one cares about the pedigree of a servant. And his sign is the ox, the beast of servitude. Luke, who's a doctor, like your local GP, I like to think of Luke like that, he starts his genealogy from Adam, and he focuses on the humanity of Jesus. And his sign is the man. John, he actually has a genealogy in the book of John, but a lot of people miss it. How does John 1:1 begin? In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then it kind of carries on. But theologians will tell you that actually that is a genealogy of the pre-existent one. So John, his symbol is the eagle. Each of the Gospels, as we know, they take a different approach to Jesus. Matthew, what Jesus said. Mark, what Jesus did. Luke, what Jesus felt. John, who Jesus was. Matthew ends with the resurrection. Mark ends with the ascension. Luke ends with the promise of the Spirit. A very clever move, because it's kind of like the precursor for Luke chapter 2, which is the book of Acts. And what's the key thing that happens in Acts? The Spirit arrives at Pentecost. And then John is all about the promise of the return. And John, of course, later in his life, he's exiled, and he writes the book of Revelation, which is all about the second coming of Christ. Matthew focuses on kingship, so the symbol of this gospel became the lion. Mark focuses on his servanthood. As I said, the ox is his symbol. Luke, his humanity, his symbol became the man. And John had a focus on revelation. And when you read about John and you learn about the history of John, he gets a nickname given to him by the church. He becomes known as the eagle of the Isle of Patmos, which is interesting. So the four faces show up as pointers in the Gospels. And who are the Gospels all about? The Son of God. Now, something I didn't mention when we looked at those symbols was that the tribe of Dan, who was allocated the eagle, the original symbol that they were given was not the eagle. And it caused, according to Jewish tradition, some immense dissatisfaction, because the original sign they were given was the serpent. So can you imagine that you're one of the tribes of Israel and everyone's getting all of these things allocated to them, and by the way, Dan, you're the serpent. And Dan had a bit of a rough ride anyway as a tribe. In fact, so much so that when they finally settled the land, a lot of the tribe of Dan got up and left. And they became boat builders, and they left. And there's a whole thing that goes on with that. But in the Hebrew worldview, a serpent, of course, had echoes of the fall. And so being allocated this symbol was seen as an insult. Actually, I'd encourage you to do your own research around this. So the tribe of Dan slowly changed their banner, and it moved from a serpent to an eagle holding the serpent, clutching the serpent, and then the serpent kind of disappears. And I find that interesting, because if everything about Israel points to Jesus, you may remember last week I talked about in the midst of this curse that God pronounces on Adam and Eve, that when he talks to the serpent, he promises a Messiah, right? And that text in Genesis 3:15 is what they call the first gospel. It's a proto-evangelism for those of you that want to do some research around that. And often called the fifth gospel. But isn't it interesting that the tribe of Dan has a symbol of a serpent that slowly gets usurped by the eagle, which is representative of Christ in Revelation around Christ? I find that fascinating. It's almost like the little details have all sort of been thought of. So in Revelation 4, we meet these four faces again, and when John has his vision of heaven, these four faces are central to what's going on there. But for the sake of time, you can do your own reading around that. Now, I just want to make a couple of further observations about the tabernacle. In the Old Testament, there is this theme of heading east. So what would happen is that when Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, what side of the garden was the sword and the cherubim? It was on the east side. And then you can go through these stories and you see things where it's like they would upset God and then they would head east. And one of the theories is that this is where they think the idea of worshipping the sun came from, because sun worship was often involved ceremonies involving the rising sun. Which direction does the sun rise in? The east, right? Now, it's interesting that when you look at the redemptive process and the way that you would go through the tabernacle, the redemption of the person involved heading west. It's another little detail that happens. One of the titles of Jesus, of course, is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And the only way into the tabernacle was past the lion. It's hugely significant. Now Jesus, of course, he has this title given to him, and I think it's the same for us today. There is only one way to God, and that is through Jesus. So everything points to Jesus, right? By the way, an interesting thing is, what you do with this is completely up to you, and as again, do your own research and make your own conclusions. But when you, can I have the next slide? When you follow the redemptive path from the events of what happened in the Garden of Gethsemane through to the cross, it started in the east and it ended in the west. I find that interesting. What you do with it is up to you, however. The other thing that I find interesting about the tabernacle is that every single one of the I am statements that Jesus uses anchors themselves back to the tabernacle. So for example, he says, I am the bread of life. Actually, that was a reference to a table in the tabernacle called the table of showbread. I am the light of the world. In the tabernacle was a massive lampstand. In fact, there was a whole feast based around that. I am the good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep. It's a reference to the bronze altar in the tabernacle in which the blood of sheep and animals was spilt. But anyway, you can do your own research around that. I find it interesting, that the way that Jesus used the words I am, and we can go into that, but it's this amazing reference of himself being God anchored back to the burning bush. But I am is absolute. When you think I am, it's funny that God reveals his name. What was his name? I am. It's absolute. The only way to God is through the Son. Now you're going to say, where are we going with this? We're circling up here. Let's land the plane. I'd like to call the worship team forward, please, at this point. It's interesting that in our Ezekiel passage, one of the things that we observe about these creatures is the fact that they moved straight forward. They did not turn as they moved. They did not deviate. They pointed prophetically to fixed things that were going to happen, and they pointed back to the tabernacle and, by default, future to Jesus. So what we see through all of this is that God has a plan. He knows what he's doing. You and I look at the world today and we can be confused by it all. But God is not confused. Through the chaos of it all, he knows what he's doing. God is moving unhesitantly towards the accomplishment of his purpose in the world today. Nothing can deter God. Nothing can sidetrack him. He is going to do what he is going to do. And it is happening in front of our eyes. He invites us to be a part of the story. So for us this morning, as we sit here in Johnsonville, 2024, I just want to encourage you that no matter where you're at in life, please remember that you have access to the Father through the Son. Blood is thicker than water. Family is everything. If we are in Christ, we are his adopted children. So it's not only my hope this morning that maybe you would walk away with something from this going, aha, there's just another piece of the puzzle that's kind of fallen into place. Some of you might go, well, I knew all that anyway, right? That's fine. I just want to encourage you all today, and I'll say it again, we have access to the Father through the Son. And that privilege is something that we should not take lightly, but there's been a lot of planning that has gone into that so that we can sit here this morning and have confidence that we are not only saved, but that we are called to something higher. So the challenge for you this morning, the challenge for me this morning, is are we seeking God for our part of his story? That's my prayer for you this morning.